Hi, this is Jenny from InfiniteLoopKnitting.com. Here's a sample of knitting where I was knitting stripes in the round, and it has several problems. I was carrying the yarn up the back of the work, and I actually wound up with some holes and even some jogs between the color changes. I just didn't really understand how to knit these stripes, but it turns out we can do much better when carrying the yarns up the back. To avoid the holes, we just need to be sure not to drop our old yarn when we pick up the new yarn. Instead, we need to carry it across the work from right to left, and then trap that yarn in the new color. And then I'll bring up the yarn of the new color and knit the first stitch with it. And if I check the other side, I should see that the old yarn is trapped behind the new yarn. And now I can continue knitting the rest of the round. All right, we finished the first round of the new color, and we now come to the next problem, which is that we don't want to create a jog. If I go ahead and I knit another round, you'll see I've just joined the last stitch of the old color to the first stitch of the new color, and that is a textbook definition of a jog, so we definitely don't want to do that. Instead, what we want to do is just slip this stitch, and this is the first stitch. I've just now demoted it to the last stitch because it hasn't been knitted yet, right? So this will get knitted when we come all the way around the round, and we'll knit the so-called first stitch last. If you need help remembering how to do that, just slip in a stitch marker, because you've moved the beginning of your round. And now I can continue knitting. All right, and now I've come up to that slipped stitch, which used to be the first stitch of the round and now is the last stitch of the round. All I need to do is knit that stitch, because we want to make sure all the columns have the same number of stitches in them. And that's the end of the second round. These are 2 round stripes, so it's time to switch colors again. And now I'm back to that problem of not wanting to create a gap. I'm going to temporarily remove the stitch marker so you can see a little better. So all I'm going to do now is make sure that the old yarn goes from the last stitch of the round across to the first stitch of the round. And then I'll bring up my new color and I'll go ahead and knit a stitch. And at this point you want to check on the back of the work to make sure that the old color is indeed trapped behind the new color. And it appears that it is, so we're okay. And then we can go ahead and put our stitch marker back on and transfer that stitch back to the right needle. And now we can continue knitting the round. And so we've come to the end of the color change round, and we're ready to start the next round. We want to be careful not to join the last stitch of the round to the first stitch of the new round, because that will create our jog. Instead, we will slip that first stitch and move our stitch marker to indicate that the round now starts 1 stitch over. And now this stitch becomes the first stitch of the round, and we'll go ahead and knit that. And what you can notice here is that the beginning of the round is starting to travel to the left. Here is what used to be the beginning of the round, and now it's way over here. And this will continue each time you change colors, and that's fine. It really doesn't matter as long as you know where the round begins and ends. All right, here we are coming up on that slipped stitch, which used to be the first stitch of the round and now is the last stitch of the round. We'll just go ahead and knit that, and that completes the round. And now it's time to change colors again. And we just continue in this manner until we have as many stripes knitted as we would like. And I'll go ahead and knit some more, and then we can take a look at the results together. All right, I've finished knitting my stripes. And you can see we have no jogs or holes in sight, so that worked out well. Here is where we first began our rounds, and you can see as we've knitted more and more rows, our first stitch of the round has migrated quite a bit from the starting point. You might just be able to make out a faint diagonal line. This is caused by our carry of the yarn up the back. If we look at the back, looks like this. It is important to keep these carries a little loose. If they're too tight, it's going to pucker on the front, and you'll have some tight stitches and a more discernible diagonal line across the work. And so that's 2 round stripes. If you want a wider stripe, just keep knitting additional rounds. Okay, I've finished knitting my 4 round stripe, and it's time to change colors. Again, I need to be careful to join the old yarn before I begin knitting with the new yarn. So I will take it across the work from right to left, and then bring up my new yarn behind the old yarn. And now I can continue knitting the rest of the round. We've finished knitting the color change round, and we're ready to knit the round after the color change. And this is where we need to do our jog avoidance maneuver, which is simply to slip the first stitch of the round and demote it to the last stitch of the round. And then continue knitting the round. I've finished knitting the round after the color change round, and now I just continue knitting additional rounds until my stripe is as wide as I want it to be. All right, I've finished knitting a couple of 4 round stripes, and I want to show you something. You may think we failed because right here it looks like we have a hole and a jog. This is due to the fact that the carried yarn slipped down a little bit. And if I just pull up on it, you'll find that that jog disappears just like that. So that is nothing at all to be concerned about. It does suggest that when you go to work in the yarns, that you should work it in up from where the stripe was joined. So if we're going to knit a really wide stripe, and I'm going to knit a 12 round stripe here, we probably do not want a super long carry going all the way up the back of the work. So what we can do is we can trap that carry in the work periodically. The way I like to do it is to trap it behind a float. So I'm going to remove the stitch marker. I'm at the first stitch of the round, which is where I recommend you execute this procedure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the carried yarn, and then we're going to slip the first stitch. At that point we can add the stitch marker, and you can see we have it trapped behind the float. So I'll put the carried yarn down, and then I will go ahead and continue knitting. And you can see what we've got here is the carry trapped behind the float. And because it's behind a float, it will be totally invisible. And just do this every 4 to 6 rounds and you should be fine. It all depends on how long a carry that you're comfortable with. All right, we've finished knitting the sample. And as you can see, our stripes are looking pretty good, not a jog in sight. So this really will fix your problem with your jogs. I would say the only issue we really have is that there is a slight diagonal line. I don't know if the camera is picking it up for you. where the yarn was carried up at a diagonal. That's just the nature of the traveling join. So it's not really something you can eliminate. If you play around with the tension and try to keep the carry loose, it'll be less noticeable. If this bothers you, there are a couple of other techniques that you can use for jogless joins as well, and I do have videos on those. You may want to look at the loose ends method or the padlock method. The loose ends method requires you to cut the yarn between each stripe. The padlock method allows you to carry the yarns up the back of the work. Here's how the back of the work looks. You can see the carries going up diagonally, and you can see where the carries were captured under the floats for the long stripes. Now try knitting some stripes of your own.